April 16, 1945, Okinawa, Pacific Ocean. The sea boils with chaos. Black smoke rolls across the horizon as the destroyer USS Laffey, DD-724, cuts through the waves, its deck trembling under the roar of engines and flak bursts. Men shout orders over the sirens. The air smells of cordite and salt. From the east, tiny specks appear. Japanese Zero fighters glinting silver in the morning light. One breaks formation and dives. Its engine screams louder and louder until it becomes a single, endless note of death. Gunners on the Laffey open fire, tracer lines slicing the sky. But the Zero keeps coming. It hits the deck with a blinding flash. The shockwave tears through steel. For a moment, the ocean is silent. Only the crackle of burning fuel remains. That day, 22 kamikaze aircraft hurled themselves at a single ship. And across Japan, commanders believed such sacrifice could still turn the tide. They were wrong, because the Allies had already turned to something Japan could not see coming: radar, discipline, and overwhelming firepower. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was dying, though few in Tokyo dared to admit it. The once mighty Imperial Navy, which had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was now a shadow of its former power. Oil convoys lay shattered across the South China Sea. Battleships that once roamed proudly now sat rusting in shallow harbors, out of fuel and out of hope. The Allies had clawed their way across the Pacific island by island: Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu. Each victory pushed American bombers closer to the Japanese homeland. From the captured Marianas, B-29 superfortresses now reached the skies over Tokyo, turning entire districts into walls of fire. In the Philippine Sea, Japan's fate had been sealed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, remembered by U.S. pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, annihilated Japan's last trained air crews. More than 600 aircraft were lost. In a single day, the Imperial Navy's carrier aviation died. Yet in defeat, Japan's war leaders sought something beyond logic, a weapon of spirit rather than steel. Within the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, whispers turned to doctrine. The nation's ancient code of Bushido, honor in death, loyalty unto the emperor, was invoked to mask the growing terror of reality. If Japan could no longer win with machines, perhaps it could win with sacrifice. It began in October 1944, during the desperate defense of the Philippines. American forces had landed at Leyte Gulf, aiming to cut Japan's last supply lines from Southeast Asia. Facing annihilation, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed something radical: a corps of pilots who would deliberately crash their aircraft into enemy ships. They would be called Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Special Attack Units. The world would know them by another name: Kamikaze. Divine Wind. To Onishi, this was not madness but mathematics. He argued that a single suicide plane, if it hit, could sink a warship worth thousands of men and millions of yen. It was, he believed, efficiency through death. At Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, the first Kamikaze Corps took form. Young volunteers barely out of flight school, some barely out of childhood. On October 25, 1944, they struck for the first time. 5 Zeros dove on American escort carriers near Samar. One hit the USS St. Lo, detonating her bomb load and sending her to the bottom within minutes. For Japan, it was a moment of grim triumph. Newspapers in Tokyo hailed the fallen pilots as gods reborn. The Imperial broadcast declared, "One plane, one ship. The weapon of victory has been found." But the truth behind the headlines was darker. Fuel was scarce. Training was rushed. Most kamikaze pilots received only a few hours of flight time before their final mission. Mechanics wept as they tightened the last bolts on aircraft that would never return. In private, even Admiral Onishi confessed unease. He wrote in his diary that Japan's situation was beyond recovery, but the kamikaze offered a way to die beautifully, a phrase that revealed not strength, but despair. Still, the attacks multiplied. As American convoys pressed through the Philippines, Japanese command believed they had finally found the one strategy the U.S. could not counter: a tactic that ignored firepower, ignored technology, ignored fear. Yet across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy began to adapt. Radar pickets extended the fleet's vision far beyond the horizon. Fighter direction centers coordinated combat air patrols with mathematical precision. Every ship learned to fight not just the enemy but the sky itself. By the end of 1944, it had become a race. Japan's human spirit against America's mechanical eyes. And as 1945 approached, both sides prepared for the battle that would test which truly ruled the Pacific, courage or calculation. By early 1945, Japan's war machine was a skeleton draped in ritual. What had begun as an emergency measure at Leyte Gulf was now official strategy. Entire air divisions were reorganized for one purpose only: to die. Across the islands of Kyushu, Formosa, and Luzon, hundreds of airstrips turned into departure grounds for the Special Attack Forces. Pilots were no longer trained to fight or return, only to fly straight, hold steady, and strike with precision born from certainty of death. Admiral Suimu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, formalized what he called the Kikusui strategy, floating chrysanthemum. The blossom, sacred in Japanese symbolism, represented purity and sacrifice. Under this plan, successive waves of kamikaze aircraft would rise from Kyushu to strike Allied fleets around Okinawa and the Philippines, one after another, like petals falling from a dying flower. Tokyo's propaganda machine turned this grim arithmetic into national theater. Posters showed smiling pilots standing beside cherry trees, the same symbol of fleeting beauty and noble death. Newspapers printed farewell poems. In every classroom and temple, citizens were told that the divine wind of old, the storm that saved Japan from the Mongols in the 13th century, had returned. But beneath the poetry, the numbers betrayed reality. Japan's industry was collapsing. Aircraft production had fallen by nearly half since 1943. Aluminum and fuel were nearly gone. Many kamikaze planes were built from wood and canvas, unable to climb or maneuver. Others were obsolete Zeros stripped of armor to save weight, carrying 250-kilogram bombs under each wing. Most of their pilots were not fanatics. They were barely trained youth. Many came from universities drawn in by a mixture of coercion, shame, and genuine patriotism. The Imperial Army and Navy competed bitterly over who could claim more volunteers, each inflating figures to please Tokyo. At Clark Field and Cabanatuan, pilots lined up for ceremonial farewell cups of sake. Some smiled for the cameras, others wept quietly, writing letters that would never reach home. In the final moments before takeoff, they were blessed by Shinto priests. Their aircraft bore white scarves fluttering from the tail, symbols of purity and a final goodbye. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American sailors were learning to recognize the signs. The radar screens aboard U.S. carriers and destroyers flickered with sudden blips, fast, low contacts approaching in clusters. Combat air patrol fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs would scramble immediately, but the kamikaze were hard to stop. They came in low, often hidden by clouds or the sun. Even if shot down, their flaming wreckage could still crash into a ship. In December 1944, during the Mindoro landings, kamikaze aircraft sank several destroyers and damaged the light cruiser Nashville, killing more than 130 men, including senior officers. For the first time, American Naval Command realized the psychological power of the tactic. Sailors called it the death that keeps coming. Admiral William F. Halsey, known for his aggressive spirit, admitted that Japan's new weapon was the most terrifying threat the fleet has ever faced. Yet he also knew that technology, discipline, and coordination could blunt even this weapon of desperation. The U.S. Navy expanded its radar coverage, turning small destroyers and escort vessels into radar picket ships stationed miles ahead of the main fleet. Their mission: detect incoming suicide planes early and vector interceptors to meet them. These ships became both the fleet's eyes and its most vulnerable targets. Every new attack revealed new data: approach patterns, altitudes, timing. Analysts aboard flagships logged everything. Anti-aircraft crews drilled relentlessly, improving aim, timing, and coordination. The introduction of proximity-fused shells, small marvels of radar technology, gave every gun the ability to explode within yards of a target, multiplying their lethality. By February 1945, the U.S. Navy had turned defense into an art form, an invisible net of detection, response, and overwhelming fire. But Japan didn't see that. In Tokyo, reports from the front still claimed enormous success. Exaggerated sinking counts, 10 carriers here, 15 battleships there, reached the emperor's desk, reinforcing the illusion that the kamikaze campaign was working. And so, When American forces began preparations to invade Okinawa, Japan prepared its largest, most desperate kamikaze offensive of the war. A storm of sacrifice and a test of technology was about to begin. To the outside world, the kamikaze were faceless, shadows diving from the sun. But behind every zero was a young man with trembling hands and a beating heart. At Chiran Air Base in southern Kyushu, the heart of the kamikaze program, the final hours before each mission followed a ritualized pattern. The pilots, often no older than 20, received their assignments in quiet briefings. They bowed, accepted their sashes, and wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Many of those letters survive. One, written by Second Lieutenant Yukio Araki, just 17 years old, reads simply, "Please take care of yourselves. I am honored to die for my country. I will go smiling." In the photographs taken before takeoff, his smile looks like that of any high school boy. Araki died the next morning over Okinawa. For some, belief in the emperor's divinity gave comfort. For others, it was unbearable pressure. In a culture where surrender was worse than death, to die willingly seemed the only way to remain pure. Yet among pilots there was no single emotion, only a collision of duty, fear, and resignation. Ground crews decorated planes with cherry blossoms. Schoolgirls sent hand-sewn scarves. Temples rang bells for each departing flight. And still, beneath the ceremony, many knew the truth. Japan was running out of everything: men, fuel, and time. While Japan turned toward spirit, America turned toward science. By late 1944, radar had become the fleet's most valuable weapon. It could detect aircraft approaching from more than 100 miles away, long before the human eye could see them. The system was layered like a living organism. Radar picket ships guarded the outer perimeter, small destroyers and escorts placed in rings around the main fleet. Each was equipped with the latest air search radar, connected by radio to fighter direction centers aboard carriers. When a blip appeared on the screen, it triggered a chain reaction. Interceptors scrambled, anti-aircraft batteries loaded, and searchlights locked to the horizon. This invisible network transformed the Pacific battlefield. In 1942, Japan had ruled the skies with surprise attacks. By 1945, surprise itself was dying. Then came the proximity fuse, a technological miracle that changed naval warfare overnight. Instead of exploding on impact, these shells detonated automatically when they came within a few yards of a target, creating deadly clouds of shrapnel in mid-air. A kamikaze pilot who once needed to dodge direct fire now faced an invisible wall of destruction. Even if he evaded one ship's defenses, dozens more guns were already tracking his path, guided by radar and coordinated fire control. The U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft umbrella became a synchronized orchestra, radar operators, gunners, and fighter pilots moving as one. But every innovation came at a cost. Picket ships, isolated far ahead of the fleet, absorbed the brunt of each kamikaze assault. Their crews knew they were human shields. The destroyer USS Bush, hit on April 6, 1945, went down under 3 successive suicide strikes. Few survived. Technology could predict an attack, but it could not replace courage. By the time of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy's approach to air defense had evolved into brutal precision. Each fleet formation resembled a fortress at sea. Carriers in the center, battleships and cruisers forming the inner ring, destroyers and picket ships as the outer guard. Above them circled layers of fighter patrols. Below, the radar screens pulsed endlessly. When a kamikaze wave was detected, the process was immediate. Interceptors were vectored in to attack from altitude. Ships went to Condition 1, every gun manned, every radar sweeping. Smoke generators cloaked the fleet in white mist to obscure visual targeting. Still, the kamikaze's simplicity made them terrifying. A pilot didn't need to survive or return. He needed only to aim. The sheer will of impact made traditional tactics obsolete. U.S. gunners described the moment before contact as timeless, the engine's scream swelling into something that sounded almost human. When a kamikaze missed, it often clipped masts or exploded in the water close enough to shower the deck with fragments and burning fuel. The psychological strain was immense. Crews slept in helmets, ate at their guns, and wrote home about nightmares of falling planes. Some sailors later admitted that they respected the kamikaze, not for what they did, but for how unrelenting they were. By April 1945, the U.S. had turned defense into a choreography of fire and calculation. But every attack still carried the same uncertainty. No radar, no fuse. No plan could erase the moment when one human being, consumed by belief, dove toward another who refused to yield. That was the war's new reality, a collision between faith and machinery. And that collision was about to reach its most violent expression. The Kikusui waves over Okinawa, the largest suicide assault in human history. Inside Japan's military hierarchy, the Kamikaze program was both faith and illusion. In late 1944, Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man credited with creating the Special Attack Corps, stood before officers at the 1st Air Fleet headquarters in Manila and declared, "In order for Japan to survive, we must sacrifice one life for one ship." To him, this was simple arithmetic, a desperate attempt to equalize a war Japan could no longer sustain. But within Japan's senior command, opinions divided sharply. Some naval strategists argued that mass suicide attacks wasted what little aviation talent remained. Others, like Onishi, saw no other path. Japan's industrial base was shattered, its training schools bombed, its pilots inexperienced. The empire had nothing left to fight with but its spirit. The army, not to be outdone, formed its own kamikaze wings, the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai. The Navy responded with even more extreme projects: piloted rockets, explosive motorboats, and manned torpedoes known as Kaiten. Behind each decision was a quiet truth that few dared speak. Japan was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to die on its own terms. Even Emperor Hirohito, who rarely intervened in military decisions, began to sense the futility. Reports reaching the Imperial Palace claimed dozens of Allied ships sunk after each wave, yet American broadcasts contradicted them. Still, the machine of sacrifice continued. Onishi himself, after the war, would leave a note before taking his own life. "I wish to apologize to the souls of these brave men. I am deeply sorry for having made them die so uselessly." For the men of the U.S. Navy, the kamikaze was more than an enemy. It was a mirror of terror. During the Battle of Okinawa, sailors spoke of an unease that even experience couldn't dull. Conventional air raids could be predicted, countered, survived, but kamikaze attacks had no rhythm, only randomness. They could come at dawn or under moonlight in pairs or by the hundreds. On radar screens, each blip meant a human being determined to die. The destroyer USS Laffey, known as the ship that would not die, became a living symbol of this ordeal. On April 16, 1945, she endured 22 separate kamikaze and bombing attacks in under 80 minutes. 5 planes struck her directly. 4 bombs exploded aboard. Her decks burned, her guns jammed, her crew fought flames with bare hands. When the smoke cleared, 32 sailors were dead, 71 wounded, but the Laffey still floated. Such resilience had a cost. In the mess decks and bunk rooms of the Pacific Fleet, fear became routine. Some men refused to sleep below deck. Others carried photos of kamikaze wreckage as grim trophies, reminders that the enemy was mortal too. Psychologists later described the kamikaze campaign as one of the most intense forms of psychological warfare in modern history. It replaced tactics with terror, strategy with inevitability, and yet for every destroyer hit, hundreds of planes never reached their targets. Radar interception, disciplined gunnery, and raw courage blunted what should have been a naval catastrophe. In the silence after each raid, a deeper question lingered. What did it mean to die for a cause already lost? For Japan's war leaders, the kamikaze represented the ultimate expression of loyalty. But loyalty to what? By 1945, there was no empire to defend, no hope of victory. Cities burned nightly under B-29 firebombing. Civilians starved while factories lay in ruins. Yet pilots continued to climb into their cockpits, bowing toward Tokyo before vanishing into the clouds. Historians still debate whether these young men were victims of coercion or heroes of conviction. Many scholars now agree it was both. Japan's rigid social system made refusal almost unthinkable. To say no meant shame for one's family, dishonor to one's ancestors, and often arrest. Yet countless letters and diaries reveal sincerity, not blind obedience, but a tragic sense of duty. On the Allied side, moral clarity also blurred. American sailors felt pity even as they fired. Some described watching a kamikaze's final moments through binoculars, the face visible behind the canopy, eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no malice in those seconds, only inevitability. Philosopher Paul Fussell later wrote, "In that brief space between radar and impact, the war ceased to be about nations. It became a contest between two human beings, each caught in the machinery of belief. The Kamikaze campaign revealed a terrifying symmetry. The collision of two civilizations, one relying on technology to preserve life, the other on sacrifice to redeem it. Neither would emerge unchanged, and as both sides braced for what came next, the colossal onslaught over Okinawa, the Pacific Ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. For Japan, the hour of its final victory had come. For America, the greatest defensive test in naval history was about to begin. April 1945, the Battle of Okinawa. It was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and the last. 500 U.S. ships ringed the island. 500,000 men prepared to storm its shores, and somewhere beyond the southern horizon, Japan prepared its final weapon of despair. The codename was Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. 10 great waves of kamikaze attacks would rise from Kyushu, each larger than the one before, to destroy the Allied fleet and drown the invasion in fire. From April through June 1945, more than 1,100 suicide aircraft were launched against the U.S. Navy. It was, in scale and ferocity, unlike anything the Pacific had ever seen. The first Kikusui came on April 6, 1945. Radar picket ships, the outermost defenders, caught the signals early. Dozens, then hundreds of blips, swarming from the north. Fighter control ordered interceptors aloft. The air filled with contrails, tracer lines, and smoke. Destroyers like the USS Bush and USS Colquhoun stood alone on the perimeter, their radar dishes spinning as anti-aircraft guns thundered. Each picket ship faced wave after wave, often with no support. Their only purpose was to absorb the first impact. By nightfall, the Bush was gone, struck 3 times, burning to the waterline before exploding. The Colquhoun followed, hit by 4 kamikazes in succession. In the command ships offshore, American admirals watched the radar screens light up like constellations. Each vanishing blip marked another plane destroyed, or another life ended in flame. But the fleet held. Despite 355 attacks that day, only a handful of ships were sunk. The rest burned, patched, and fought on. The Okinawa campaign transformed naval warfare into a sustained aerial siege. Each day, Japan launched new kamikaze formations from Kyushu and Formosa. Some were escorted by fighters. Others flew alone, guided only by intuition and fate. Many never even reached the target, intercepted, shot down, or lost to weather and exhaustion. American air crews called them bogies. On radar scopes, the pattern was familiar. A cluster of returns spreading like a fan, descending fast. Within minutes, gunners would see them, sunlight flashing off wings, propellers glinting like knives. Every ship became its own universe of terror. The USS Bunker Hill, a fleet carrier loaded with bombs and fuel, took 2 kamikaze hits within 30 seconds on May 11, 1945. The explosions tore through the hangar deck, igniting everything inside. More than 600 men were killed or wounded in minutes. The ship survived, but her flight deck was a ruin of fire. Nearby, the USS Laffey, already scarred from previous battles, was attacked by 22 aircraft in less than an hour. She took direct hits from 5 and yet refused to sink. One sailor described the scene as a wall of flame and thunder. Another wrote later, "There were no breaks between attacks and just a blur of screams and impact." Despite the onslaught, the U.S. Navy's system of radar, discipline, and coordination proved decisive. The Combat Information Centers, CICs, aboard ships became the nerve centers of survival. Men bent over glowing screens, vectoring fighters by voice commands, calling out bearing and altitude as the sky erupted. From the Japanese perspective, the Okinawa offensive was meant to be redemption, a divine storm to drive the invaders back. But after each Kikusui, reality grew darker. Reports from the front exaggerated success. 15 carriers destroyed, 30 ships sunk. In truth, only a fraction of those claims were real. Allied repair crews worked miracles. Ships aflame one day were operational within weeks. The kamikaze could wound but not stop an industrial giant. By mid-April, Japan's supply of trained pilots had collapsed. Many kamikazes were student trainees, barely able to take off, guided by instructors who turned back before the coast. Some aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched in the sea before ever reaching Okinawa. Still, the orders kept coming. From Kyushu's airfields, hundreds of planes lifted off each dawn, their wings heavy with bombs, their pilots light with fate. Ground crews stood at attention until the last speck vanished beyond the horizon, then turned away, unable to watch what came next. Each week, the pattern repeated. Each week, fewer Japanese planes returned. By the end of April, American radar crews could sense the strain. Attacks grew smaller, less coordinated. The U.S. Navy had adapted. Fighter intercepts improved, anti-aircraft coordination became almost machine-like. Every destroyer, cruiser, and carrier moved as part of one defensive organism. In contrast, Japan's air command disintegrated under the weight of its own losses. Oil was nearly gone. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Airfields became graveyards of burned-out fuselages. And above it all, the U.S. radar network, those invisible eyes, never blinked. For every kamikaze that reached its target, dozens vanished unseen, intercepted by aircraft guided solely by the cold precision of a radar operator's voice. The Kikusui waves had been meant to turn the tide. Instead, they revealed how far Japan had already fallen. Yet the fury was not over. Because in the final weeks of May and June 1945, the kamikaze would strike harder than ever. One last, hopeless surge before silence. May 1945, Okinawa. The horizon no longer carried dawn. It carried smoke. Every morning, radar screens aboard the picket ships flickered alive, each green pulse marking a storm of metal that never seemed to end. By now, the Americans had fought off more than 1,000 suicide aircraft, and they knew more were coming. On the Japanese mainland, the Kikusui operations continued without pause. Pilots were briefed in candlelit rooms, some still wearing student uniforms. Many had logged fewer than 30 flight hours. Aircraft engines sputtered with low-grade fuel mixed from pine oil. The once proud squadrons of the Imperial Navy now resembled ghost fleets. Yet the orders did not change. Launch at dawn. Strike the enemy ships. Die with honor. Between May 4 and May 11th, the 5th and 6th Kikusui waves struck. Hundreds of aircraft filled the southern skies. Their approach marked first by radar, then by the distant rumble of engines. Each attack seemed endless, a blur of white trails, gunfire, and blossoms of black smoke. Destroyers like the USS Morrison, USS Shea, and USS Luce became legends of endurance. Each one faced the impossible, standing alone against dozens of attackers. The Morrison was hit 4 times before she went down in flames, taking over 150 men with her. On the USS Shea, a suicide plane carrying a 500-kilogram bomb slammed into the deck. The blast ripped open the hull, killing 35 and wounding 85. Yet within hours, her guns were firing again. This was the rhythm of Okinawa. Destruction, repair, resistance. By now, American defense had evolved into something close to perfection. Radar operators detected incoming formations more than 100 miles out. Fighter direction centers vectored Corsairs and Hellcats to intercept with clockwork precision. The sky became a grid of response, mathematics triumphing over desperation. Destroyers stationed along the radar picket line, codenamed Stations 1 through 15, functioned as the first alarm. They absorbed the initial impact, often at terrible cost. On May 11th, Picket Station 10 was obliterated when multiple kamikazes broke through. The USS Evans fought off 4 attackers, downing 3 before the 4th tore through her bow. She stayed afloat barely. Her decks blackened, but her flag still flying. Behind them, the fleet tightened formation. The massive Iowa-class battleships, once built for ship-to-ship duels, now turned their 40mm and 5-inch guns skyward. Their fire control systems, synchronized with radar and proximity fuses, created walls of steel so dense that pilots described it as flying into a thunderstorm made of metal. Even so, some kamikazes broke through. 1-0 clipped the bridge of the carrier USS Enterprise, blowing a crater in her flight deck and ending her combat service. Another struck the USS Bunker Hill, igniting a chain reaction of fuel explosions that killed 393 men. Every impact felt personal. Every loss echoed across the fleet. But the line never broke. Inside Japan, the illusion of success was unraveling. Fuel reserves were gone. Aircraft production had slowed to a trickle. Pilots were being trained in weeks instead of months. The skies over Kyushu, once crowded with formations, now held only a few scattered flights each day. By late May, air commanders reported the unthinkable. No more planes left to launch. Hangars stood empty. Mechanics scavenged wrecks to keep a handful of aircraft airborne. Even the Oka rocket bombs, Japan's last innovation, human-guided missiles launched from bombers, failed to change the outcome. Most were destroyed long before reaching their targets. Still, headquarters in Tokyo issued new orders. One final kikusui, one last divine wind. On June 21, 1945, the 10th and final wave rose into the gray sky. It was smaller than ever. A few dozen aircraft, most flown by boys who had never seen combat. American radar picked them up immediately. Within hours, every one of them was gone. No ship was sunk that day. It was over. The Kamikaze campaign, the largest organized suicide assault in human history, had failed. In the aftermath, silence hung over Okinawa. On the beaches, U.S. Marines still fought bitterly against Japanese ground forces, but at sea, the sky finally cleared. The fleet, scarred, battered, but undefeated, stood as proof of endurance over despair. Between April and June 1945, Japan had launched nearly 1,900 kamikaze missions against the U.S. fleet. They damaged or sank more than 300 ships, killed nearly 5,000 sailors and wounded thousands more. Yet the cost to Japan was catastrophic. Nearly 4,000 aircraft lost, 5,000 pilots dead, and no strategic gain achieved. The divine wind that was meant to save Japan had instead blown its air arm to extinction. By the end of June, U.S. forces controlled Okinawa. From its airfields, B-29s could now strike Tokyo without pause. For Japan, there were no more miracles left, only the approaching shadow of atomic fire. But before surrender came reflection, a reckoning with what those final months had truly meant. For Japan's command, for the sailors who faced the endless sky, and for a world that had just witnessed the first industrialized form of suicide warfare. When the guns fell silent over Okinawa in late June 1945, the ocean was still littered with debris, twisted fuselages, oil slicks, and drifting wreckage that shimmered in the sunlight. But beneath that calm surface, something far more profound was broken. The last illusion that Japan's courage could overcome America's technology. The Kamikaze campaign had been born from desperation, yet by the end it had consumed the very thing it sought to defend: Japan's young generation, its air fleet, and its faith in victory. In total, nearly 4,900 Japanese pilots had died in suicide missions. Some were naval aviators with years of experience. Most were teenage cadets pulled from universities in 1944. They were told their sacrifice would save the empire. Instead, it only delayed the inevitable. On the Allied side, the numbers were staggering but survivable. More than 36 U.S. ships were sunk and 368 damaged, with nearly 5,000 sailors killed and 5,000 wounded. The worst month, May 1945, saw over 1,000 aircraft destroyed and dozens of ships hit in a single week. Yet despite this, the U.S. Navy never broke formation. The carriers continued to launch strikes. The convoys kept advancing. The line held. That resilience sent a devastating message to Tokyo. Even death itself could not halt American firepower. For the Japanese people, news of the kamikaze missions had initially been presented as triumph. Newspapers spoke of heroic blows against the U.S. Navy. Propaganda broadcasts declared that American fleets were retreating under the divine wind. But as weeks passed, reality seeped through. Families received telegrams by the thousands. Short, formal messages marked with the imperial seal. No bodies were returned, only the promise that their sons had died for the emperor. The emotional toll was immense. Entire classes of students vanished. Universities stood half empty. Mothers wept silently during morning prayers. By summer, Japan had lost nearly an entire generation of educated youth. Inside the military, morale collapsed. Pilots who had survived mechanical failures or missed their targets returned to bases in shame. Some begged for permission to fly again. Others faced isolation, branded as dishonored. Officers struggled to maintain the myth that these deaths meant something greater, but even they began to doubt. A diary recovered from a kamikaze airbase in Kyushu captured the mood. They tell us our lives will buy Japan one more day. But what can one day buy when tomorrow already belongs to the enemy? For the Americans, the aftermath was equally sobering. Okinawa was won, but at staggering cost, and over 12,000 U.S. dead and 36,000 wounded. The kamikaze attacks had inflicted a psychological weight that far outlasted the battle itself. Veterans recalled the dread of radar alarms, the sound of incoming aircraft that meant someone somewhere had decided to die just to kill them. Many sailors admitted that the fear of kamikaze strikes was worse than facing enemy guns. Naval commanders studied every engagement, searching for lessons. The U.S. Navy improved radar coordination, strengthened damage control, and began experimenting with rapid response fire patterns. The use of proximity-fused shells was expanded, and picket ships were given heavier anti-aircraft armament. Yet even amid the victory, officers like Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized something unsettling. The Kamikaze had proven that technology alone could not completely shield against fanaticism. No defense was perfect against a man who did not intend to live. That realization haunted Allied planners as they turned toward the next target, Japan itself. Would the entire nation fight like the Kamikaze? Would the beaches of Kyushu become another Okinawa, multiplied 100-fold? Those questions would soon drive the decision that ended the war, in a way no one could have imagined. And as Japan's skies fell silent, another storm was forming. One not of aircraft or courage, but of science and fire, waiting on an island called Tinian. July 1945, Tokyo. The capital lay in ruins. From the air it looked like an ocean of ash. Grid after grid of burned-out blocks with only a few concrete skeletons standing. The firebomb raids had erased entire districts, leaving nothing but silence where once millions had lived. In the Imperial Palace, the reality that Japan could no longer fight was now impossible to ignore. Reports from Okinawa were grim. The Navy destroyed, the Army decimated, and the Air Force, the pride of the nation, reduced to a handful of untrained boys and obsolete planes. The Kamikaze miracle had not come. By mid-July, Japan's once mighty air arm had ceased to exist. Factories lay shattered under B-29 bombardment. Aviation fuel reserves had dropped to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Even wooden training planes were being stripped for parts. When officers proposed another wave of suicide missions, staff officers at Imperial headquarters could only stare in silence. There were no aircraft left to send, and no pilots left to fly them. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, quietly admitted the truth to his aides. The sky is lost. The seas are lost. There is no more honor to be found in dying for nothing. But outside those walls, Japan's people still clung to illusion. Propaganda insisted that the Kamikaze spirit had shaken the Americans. That a new weapon, perhaps divine, perhaps secret, would soon appear. It was a lie told for survival. In early August, that illusion shattered forever. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 Enola Gay crossed Japan's morning sky and released a bomb over Hiroshima. Within seconds, an entire city vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. To many in Japan's command, it felt like a divine reversal. The same empire that had once sent men to die in flames now watched as its people burned from a single burst of light. Emperor Hirohito, who had once blessed Kamikaze squadrons as gods protecting the homeland, was shown photographs of Hiroshima. He said nothing for a long time. Then in a quiet voice he said, "We must endure the unendurable." On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice echoed across Japan, the first time his people had ever heard it. In a broadcast trembling with sorrow, he announced surrender. He did not mention the word defeat. He spoke instead of preserving human civilization. But every listener knew. The war and the age of the Kamikaze were over. In the ruins of air bases across Kyushu and Honshu, the remnants of Kamikaze wings sat abandoned. Their fuselages riddled with rust, their rising sun emblems faded by rain. Young ground crewmen stood in silence beside the aircraft that had once carried their friends into the sky. For many survivors, the guilt was unbearable. Pilots who had trained for suicide missions but never flown them struggled for decades with the question, why they had lived while others had died. In post-war Japan, the Kamikaze were remembered with both pride and sorrow. Memorials were built, not to glorify death but to mourn it, to remind future generations of the price paid when duty becomes desperation. At the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots, visitors still read the final letters written by those boys before their last flights. Mother, do not grieve. When you see the cherry blossoms fall, remember me. The cherry blossom, once a symbol of beauty and renewal, had become Japan's emblem of loss. For the Allies, the Kamikaze legacy reshaped the future of warfare. Radar integration, electronic detection, and layered anti-aircraft systems became the new doctrine. Every carrier group that sailed after 1945 bore the lessons of Okinawa: vigilance, coordination, and the understanding that no technology could ever be taken for granted again. But perhaps the deepest legacy was psychological. The kamikaze had shown that even in modern mechanized war, belief, however misguided, could still drive men beyond fear, beyond logic, beyond survival. It was both a warning and a testament. As Japan rebuilt from ashes, the memory of those final months lingered. The sound of engines diving, the flash of fire over the sea, and the haunting truth that courage without hope is only tragedy. And yet, in that tragedy, humanity glimpsed its own reflection of how far people will go when the world itself seems lost. The Pacific is calm again. Waves wash gently against the reefs of Okinawa, where twisted steel still rests beneath the surface. The silent graves of ships and men who once fought beneath skies of fire. 80 years later, the sound of those engines has faded, but the question they carried still echoes. What drives a man to die believing he can change the course of history? For Japan, the kamikaze were both heroes and victims, symbols of devotion, yet prisoners of an impossible cause. They were told that sacrifice could become salvation, that courage could defeat machines, but history showed otherwise. In the age of radar, of fuses that could think and guns that never slept, bravery alone was no longer enough. The kamikaze story became more than a tale of war. It became a mirror held up to the modern world, a reminder that human conviction, when twisted by desperation, can destroy the very future it seeks to protect. And yet beneath that darkness there was still something deeply human, the yearning to matter, to defend one's homeland, to make a final act mean something. That is why the kamikaze remain haunting even now. They were not monsters. They were boys caught in a tide larger than themselves, flying toward destiny with the faith that their deaths would buy their nation one more sunrise. In the end, that sunrise came, but not through death nor divine wind. It came through surrender, through rebuilding, through the decision to live. The Japan that rose from ashes became a nation of peace, of innovation, of reflection, shaped by the ghosts of those who once believed that dying was the only way to serve. And perhaps that is the quiet truth left behind by the kamikaze, that even at the edge of despair, humanity always finds a way back to life.